The money was there. The records confirmed it. The signatures matched. And yet, somehow, $62 million had moved across 4 continents, through 17 shell companies, in ways that the banks themselves could not fully explain. And neither could the man whose name was on every single one of those transactions. That man was alive. He was not in hiding. He had not fled the country. He was, at the time investigators first flagged his accounts, sitting in a glass-walled office in downtown Chicago, managing a legitimate wealth advisory firm with a client list that included retired federal judges, 2 former senators, and a philanthropic foundation that had just received a commendation from the governor of Illinois. His name was Daniel Mercer, 51 years old, 23 years in financial services, 0 prior criminal record. And the deeper investigators looked into what he had allegedly done, the less sense any of it made. Not because the evidence was thin. The evidence was extensive, time-stamped, cross-referenced, audited by 3 separate forensic accounting firms. The problem wasn't the lack of evidence. The problem was that the evidence, when you put it all together, told 2 completely different stories. And both of them were backed by documents that should not have been able to coexist. This is the case that still hasn't been fully resolved. Not because the investigation was abandoned, not because Mercer disappeared, but because the more pieces they assembled, the more clearly it became that someone, or something, had constructed a fraud so precisely contradictory that solving one layer of it only deepened the mystery of another. This is what the file actually shows. Daniel Mercer didn't come from money. That detail matters more than it might seem, because one of the central questions that would eventually haunt this case was motivation. Why would a man who had spent 2 decades carefully, methodically building credibility risk everything on a scheme this size? He grew up in Gary, Indiana, the son of a machinist and a school librarian. By every account from people who knew him during those years, teachers, coaches, childhood friends who would later be interviewed by federal agents, he was driven in a specific, almost clinical way. Not charismatic, not flashy, precise, organized. Someone who liked systems. Someone who found comfort in structures that operated according to predictable rules. He put himself through the University of Illinois on scholarships and part-time work. He graduated with honors in finance and economics. He spent 3 years at a mid-tier brokerage in Indianapolis before landing a position at Halcyon Capital Management in Chicago, which at the time was one of the most respected boutique wealth management firms in the Midwest. He spent 9 years at Halcyon. He was never the most visible person in the room. He didn't court attention, but his client retention rate was, by internal metrics, the highest in the firm. People trusted him, and not just with their portfolios, with their plans, their fears, their long-term thinking. He was the kind of advisor who remembered that a client's daughter was starting college in 2 years, and who factored that into a rebalancing conversation without being asked. In 2013, he left Halcyon to open his own firm, Mercer Capital Advisors, small, selective. By the time it came to the attention of federal investigators, it had 47 clients and approximately $380 million in assets under management. That's the portrait. That's the baseline. A careful, disciplined, well-regarded professional with a reputation built over more than 2 decades of consistent, unglamorous work. Now watch what happens when the documents enter the frame. The first flag came in March of 2021. It didn't come from a whistleblower. It didn't come from a disgruntled client. It came from an automated transaction monitoring system at a mid-sized regional bank in Milwaukee that detected an unusual pattern in a series of wire transfers connected to a holding company called Vantage Meridian LLC. Vantage Meridian was registered in Delaware. Its listed business purpose was investment consulting and asset optimization. It had 1 employee on record, an administrative coordinator whose name would later prove to be fictitious. Its registered agent was a law firm that, investigators would discover, had processed the incorporation of over 300 similar entities in the preceding 4 years. The pattern the monitoring system flagged was specific. Funds were moving into Vantage Meridian from multiple source accounts, sitting for between 48 and 72 hours, and then fragmenting into smaller transfers that moved to a second layer of entities before eventually consolidating again, often in offshore accounts in jurisdictions with strong financial secrecy laws. Classic layering, textbook structuring, the kind of pattern that financial crimes units train on. When investigators traced Vantage Meridian's ownership structure, they found, after 3 layers of intermediary entities, a name they recognized. A name attached to a legitimate, registered, fully licensed investment advisory firm in Chicago. Daniel Mercer. At that point, the investigation felt straightforward. A seemingly respectable advisor had built a parallel structure to move money outside of regulatory oversight. It happened. It happened more often than the public tended to think. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit opened a formal inquiry, assigned a team, and began the process of peeling back the layers. And that's when the case stopped making sense. The first thing that didn't fit was the money itself. When forensic accountants began reconstructing the flow of funds through Vantage Meridian and its affiliated entities, they expected to find one of 2 things. Either money was being skimmed from client accounts, embezzled, essentially, and routed through the shell structure to hide it. Or Mercer was facilitating transactions for outside parties, acting as a launderer for funds that originated elsewhere, and taking a percentage for his services. Both are common. Both are well-documented crime patterns. Both leave recognizable signatures in the financial record. What they found was neither. The money moving through Vantage Meridian didn't match any of Mercer's client accounts. None of it. The forensic team spent 6 weeks doing a full reconciliation of every account under Mercer Capital Advisors management against every transaction that flowed through the shell structure. The numbers didn't overlap. Not partially. Not in ways that could be attributed to deliberate obscuring. They simply weren't connected, which raised an immediate and deeply uncomfortable question. If Mercer wasn't moving client money, whose money was it? The total volume through Vantage Meridian and its associated entities over a period of approximately 31 months was $62 million. That is not a trivial sum. It does not materialize from nowhere. It has an origin. It has a source. And that source, despite everything the investigation had access to, bank records, wire transfer documentation, incorporation filings, beneficial ownership registries in multiple jurisdictions, could not be clearly identified. That should not have been possible. With that level of documentation, with international cooperation requests sent to financial regulators in 4 countries, with access to records spanning multiple banking systems, the origin of $62 million should have been traceable. It wasn't, and investigators didn't yet understand why. Here's what made it stranger. Because it gets stranger. While the forensic team was working the financial thread, a separate unit was conducting what they expected to be a standard background and communications review. Email records, phone logs, the kind of digital trail that, in financial crime investigations, typically produces a rich picture of coordination and intent. They requested records from Mercer's firm's email servers, from his personal accounts, from the business communication platforms his firm used. They subpoenaed records from the mobile carrier associated with his registered phone number. The records came back. All of them. Complete, apparently intact, covering the relevant period. And there was nothing in them. Not nothing in the sense that communications had been deleted. When records are deleted, forensic examiners can often detect the deletion itself. The metadata shifts, the timestamps show discontinuities, the storage patterns reflect activity that isn't represented in the remaining content. That wasn't what they found here. They found records that appeared complete and unaltered. Normal business correspondence, client communications, scheduling, administrative operations. The ordinary texture of a small advisory firm going about its works. What they didn't find was a single communication, not one email, not one text message, not one recorded call, that referenced Vantage Meridian or any of its affiliated entities, or any of the offshore accounts connected to the structure, or any of the individuals whose names appeared in the incorporation documents. In a $62 million fraud operation spanning 31 months across 17 entities, involving wire transfers to accounts in 4 different countries, there was not one documented communication between Daniel Mercer and any component of that structure. Investigators had seen defendants use burner phones. They'd seen encrypted messaging platforms. They'd seen hand-delivered notes and in-person coordination specifically designed to avoid digital trails. All of those avoidance strategies leave their own kind of evidence. Patterns of absence, anomalies in behavior, unexplained gaps. None of those patterns appeared in Mercer's record either. It was as if the entire financial structure had been built, operated, and managed by a ghost wearing his name. At this point, the lead investigator on the case, a 17-year veteran of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, whose name has been withheld from public filings, reportedly told her supervisor that she had never encountered a fraud case where the documentary evidence was this extensive and the behavioral evidence was this absent. She wasn't expressing doubt about Mercer's guilt. She was expressing something more fundamental, confusion about the architecture of what she was looking at. Because in her experience and in the experience of her team, financial crime at this scale required coordination. It required relationships. It required ongoing management. Someone had to be monitoring those accounts, making transfer decisions, maintaining the entity structure, responding when something needed adjustment. That is not a passive process. It generates contact. It generates communication. It generates a record of human decision-making. And all of that was missing. The hypothesis the team began working with, reluctantly because it opened uncomfortable implications, was that Mercer might not be operating this structure himself. That he might, in some way they hadn't yet understood, be either a frontman who had ceded operational control or someone whose identity had been used without full knowledge of what was being done in his name. That second possibility, that Mercer might be a victim, not a perpetrator, is where the case became genuinely difficult. Because if that was true, it raised questions that were almost harder to answer than the original ones. Who had the capability to construct a 31-month, $62 million multi-jurisdictional financial operation using someone else's identity without that person detecting it? What would that require in terms of access, technical sophistication, and insider knowledge? And why specifically Daniel Mercer, a careful, methodical man with an impeccable professional record and no apparent vulnerabilities that would make him an obvious target? The team didn't have answers, so they went back to the documents. In the incorporation records for Vantage Meridian and its affiliated entities, investigators found signatures, not digital signatures, physical signatures, or at least documents that had been presented as bearing physical signatures, on formation paperwork, on account opening documents, on authorization forms. They sent those signatures to a forensic document examiner retained by the FBI, someone with 30 years of experience in handwriting analysis and document authentication, whose testimony had been accepted as expert evidence in federal courts across multiple jurisdictions. Her conclusion was carefully worded but unambiguous in its implications. The signatures on the Vantage Meridian documents were consistent with Daniel Mercer's known handwriting samples. Not identical, handwriting varies across instances, and no examiner will testify to absolute certainty, but consistent, within the range that her methodology recognized as belonging to the same writer. That finding seemed, at first, to move the case back toward Mercer's direct involvement. He signed the documents. His hand made those marks. Except, when the same examiner was asked to analyze the relationship between the signatures on different documents within the corporate structure, not comparing them to Mercer's samples, but comparing them to each other, she identified something that she flagged as anomalous. Signatures on documents separated by as little as 2 weeks showed a level of internal consistency that was, in her assessment, unusually high. Almost unnaturally high. Natural signatures, even from the same person, vary slightly with mood, physical state, writing surface, and dozens of other factors. The variation across Mercer's known legitimate signatures was consistent with what she expected from a real person signing documents over time. The variation across the Vantage Meridian signatures was tighter. Too tight in her estimation. Consistent in the way that reproductions tend to be consistent, not in the way that a living person writing in real time tends to be consistent. She would not go further than that in her written report. She was careful about the limits of what her methodology could prove, but she noted the anomaly, she documented it, and she made clear that it warranted further examination, which it received, and which produced results that didn't resolve the anomaly, they deepened it. The further examination took the form of a full document authentication review, brought in specialists in paper analysis, ink chemistry, and digital document forensics. Their job was to determine whether the physical documents bearing Mercer's apparent signatures were genuine, prepared at the times indicated by their dates, or whether they showed signs of fabrication. This process takes time. It's painstaking. The analysis of paper composition, ink aging, and printing characteristics can detect forgeries that pass visual inspection with ease. It's one of the most reliable tools investigators have when document authenticity is in question. The results came back 8 weeks into this phase of the investigation. The documents were, with a high degree of analytical confidence, genuine. The paper stock was consistent with the date ranges indicated. The ink showed aging patterns appropriate to documents of the stated age. The printing characteristics were consistent with commercially available equipment. There were no signs of digital manipulation in the scanned versions. There were no signs of physical alteration in the originals. The documents appeared to be exactly what they purported to be: formation paperwork and authorization forms bearing Daniel Mercer's signature, prepared on the dates those documents indicated, through processes that left no detectable signs of fabrication. Except the handwriting examiner had flagged an anomaly. And that anomaly was real. Her methodology was sound, and her credentials were impeccable. And document authenticity and handwriting consistency are not the same question. A document can be genuine in every physical characteristic and still bear a signature that was produced through means other than a person sitting down and signing it in the ordinary way. So now investigators had genuine documents with signatures consistent with Mercer's handwriting that nonetheless showed a pattern of regularity more consistent with reproduction than with natural variation, in a financial structure that bore his name and his ownership, that had generated $62 million in transactions with no communication record connecting him to any of it. Every answer they developed created a new question it couldn't answer. They interviewed Mercer. Of course they did. At this stage of the investigation, they brought him in, initially as a witness, then as a subject, and they asked him about Vantage Meridian. His response was not what they expected. He didn't lawyer up immediately, which surprised them. He sat across from 2 federal agents in an interview room, and he looked at the documents they placed in front of him, and he spent a long time looking at them without speaking. Then he said something that investigators found deeply unsettling. Not because it was evasive, but because of how specific it was. He told them that he had never heard of Vantage Meridian LLC. He told them that the signatures on the documents were not his. He told them that he had never opened accounts at the banks listed as depositories for the shell structure. And then he told them something that he could not possibly have known was significant unless he had access to information investigators hadn't released. He told them that he had, approximately 32 months earlier, just before the period when Vantage Meridian's activity began, received an inquiry from a due diligence firm he didn't recognize claiming to be conducting a background review on behalf of a potential institutional client. The inquiry had requested, among other things, copies of his professional certifications, his signature card from his firm's banking relationships, and a notarized copy of his identification. He had provided all of it, without hesitation. Because he received similar requests periodically, as any registered investment advisor does, they were routine. He'd responded to dozens of them over his career. He had no record of the due diligence firm's contact information. He'd purged his email correspondence in a routine cleanup approximately 18 months prior. The firm's name, which he remembered as something along the lines of Presidio Verification Group, produced no results in any corporate registry investigators checked across 22 states. It had never existed. Or if it had been dissolved so thoroughly that no trace remained. Investigators sat with that. A due diligence inquiry, a perfectly normal, completely unremarkable type of professional contact that an advisor like Mercer would receive and respond to without a second thought. Arriving precisely in the window before Vantage Meridian was incorporated, requesting precisely the materials that would allow someone to open accounts, sign documents, and build a corporate structure in his name. That sequence was either a devastating coincidence or a meticulously planned setup. And both of those possibilities had problems. If it was a coincidence, if the due diligence inquiry was unrelated, if Mercer genuinely had built this structure himself, through some means investigators simply hadn't traced, Then the absence of any behavioral, communication, or operational evidence connecting him to $62 million in transactions across 31 months represented a level of counter-surveillance discipline that was frankly extraordinary. Not impossible, but extraordinary. The kind of discipline that typically belongs to people with specific training and experience. Daniel Mercer had no such background. His career was entirely civilian. His professional history contained nothing that would explain that level of operational security. If it was a setup, if someone had deliberately constructed a fraudulent identity overlay using stolen professional materials, then whoever did it had accessed and weaponized a legitimate advisor's credentials to build a real financial infrastructure, moved $62 million through it, and exited without leaving any trace that connected them to the structure they'd created. That implied a level of sophistication, resources, and planning that raised an immediate question. What was the $62 million for? Because in most financial crimes, the money is the point. The complexity of the structure is a means to protect and legitimize criminal proceeds. The goal is to put illicit money into a form that can be spent or reinvested without attracting attention. But the $62 million that moved through Vantage Meridian and its affiliated entities didn't consolidate into a spendable form. It moved through the structure and then, at the far end, it fragmented again into small transfers, into a dozen different accounts in 4 jurisdictions, in amounts and patterns that didn't correspond to any recognizable consumption or investment behavior. It didn't look like someone who had laundered money and then spent it. It looked like someone who had moved money and then hidden it in plain sight, deliberately, methodically, in pieces too small to activate automated scrutiny, but too numerous to easily reconstruct. The money wasn't being cleaned, it was being stored. Or it was being staged. For what, investigators couldn't determine. The charging decision became one of the most contentious internal debates the relevant field office had experienced in years, according to sources familiar with the deliberations. The case against Mercer, on its surface, appeared substantial. His name was on the entities. His signatures, according to forensic analysis, were on the documents. The financial structure operated under his nominal control. Under federal law, that's a starting point for prosecution. But the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit operates under prosecutorial discretion guidelines that account for the strength of the full evidentiary picture. And the full evidentiary picture here was, to use language that appeared in an internal review document later obtained through a public records request, unprecedented in its internal inconsistency. The prosecution would have to contend with the absence of any communication record. It would have to contend with the document authentication findings that raised questions about the signatures. It would have to contend with the due diligence inquiry, which, if believed, gave Mercer a plausible and specific account of how his identity materials could have been accessed. And it would have to contend with the origin of the $62 million, which remained unresolved, and which, if Mercer were innocent, pointed toward a perpetrator whose identity the investigation had not established. On the other side, his name was on everything. The money was real. The structure was real. 31 months of transactions were real. And the story about the due diligence inquiry was, in the end, unverifiable. The firm didn't exist. The correspondence was gone. There was no one who could corroborate it. In February of 2023, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Daniel Mercer on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. He was arrested at his office. He posted bail. He retained a defense team. The trial has not yet concluded, but here's where the case adds a layer that almost no one has reported on. Because while the criminal proceedings against Mercer moved through the pretrial phase, something happened on a parallel track that the prosecution did not anticipate and has not yet fully explained. A financial intelligence unit operating in cooperation with a European regulatory authority, the specific country has not been publicly identified, conducted its own analysis of the offshore accounts connected to the Vantage Meridian structure. They were working a separate matter, and the Mercer-linked accounts appeared in their data as a secondary thread. What they found, and what they communicated to their U.S. counterparts through official channels, was that the funds in those offshore accounts, the fragmented, dispersed, staged deposits that appeared to be the terminus of the $62 million flow, had moved again. They had moved after the indictment, after Mercer was under arrest and bail conditions, after his firm's assets had been frozen pending the proceedings. Someone had accessed those accounts. Someone had moved that money, and whoever had done it through authorization credentials that investigators could not trace to Mercer. Because at the time the movement occurred, Mercer was subject to conditions that would have made it logistically and practically extremely difficult for him to conduct unauthorized international financial transactions without detection. The U.S. prosecution team was informed of this development. The information was incorporated into the ongoing case file. It has not been made public through any formal court filing. Two people familiar with the investigation, speaking independently and without coordination, described the reaction within the prosecutorial team as something close to alarm. Because if the money had moved after the indictment, through credentials that weren't Mercer's, then whoever had actually operated the Vantage Meridian structure was still operational, still in control of assets, still capable of moving $62 million, or what remained of it, across international banking systems without triggering the mechanisms that were supposed to be monitoring for exactly that. And Mercer was sitting in Chicago, on bail, attending pre-trial hearings, with his passport surrendered to the court. There are several possible frameworks for understanding this case. None of them close completely. That's not an admission of failure. That's the reality of what the evidence produces when you examine it honestly. The first framework is that Daniel Mercer built the Vantage Meridian structure, ran it successfully for 31 months, used counter-surveillance measures sophisticated enough to eliminate his operational footprint, fabricated the due diligence inquiry story as a defense strategy, and had confederates who were still managing the offshore assets after his arrest. This framework accommodates the forensic evidence of his signatures. It struggles with the complete absence of any communication or behavioral evidence, and with explaining where he acquired the counter-surveillance capability the operation would have required. The second framework is that Mercer was set up, that someone used his professional materials obtained through the fraudulent due diligence inquiry to build a structure in his name, ran the operation while he remained unaware, and constructed a case so thoroughly in his name that it withstood forensic scrutiny on every dimension except the behavioral and communicational, which the actual perpetrators knew would be absent because they were the ones operating it. This framework accommodates the communication vacuum and the post-indictment account movements. It struggles with explaining why the signatures were consistent with his writing even under analysis, and with establishing who specifically had the capability and motive to construct something this elaborate. The third framework, and this is the one that investigators have been most reluctant to discuss openly, but which appears in the margins of documents, in the careful language of internal reviews, and in the off-record comments of people familiar with the case, is that the truth involves elements of both. That Mercer may have had some relationship to the structure that doesn't fit the clean narrative of either victim or perpetrator. That there may have been an arrangement, voluntary or coerced, complete or partial, that has not been established by the evidence available and may not be establishable at all. That framework produces the most discomfort precisely because it doesn't resolve into something clean. It suggests a kind of complicity without control, or knowledge without full participation, or involvement that began in one category and shifted to another. It's the least satisfying explanation and potentially the most accurate one. The forensic document examiner's anomaly has never been formally resolved. The prosecution has not addressed it directly in any filing. The defense has noted it in pre-trial motions as evidence of document irregularity, but has not produced a competing expert opinion that goes further than the original finding. The origin of the $62 million remains officially unestablished. The government's theory, embedded in the indictment, describes the funds as proceeds from fraudulent investment schemes operating prior to the Vantage Meridian transactions. But the specific schemes, the specific victims, and the specific mechanisms of generation have not been publicly identified in a way that allows for independent verification. The Presidio Verification Group has not been found. The post-indictment movement of funds from the offshore accounts has not been officially attributed to any individual or entity. And the case against Daniel Mercer proceeds toward trial on a timeline that has already been delayed 3 times for reasons that the court has sealed from public access. What this case refuses to do is collapse into a simple story. The evidence says Mercer's name is on everything. The evidence also says no trace of him operating that structure has ever been found. The documents are genuine. The signatures are slightly too consistent. The money moved through a structure that someone built in his name, and then it moved again after he was arrested, and no one has publicly explained how. He is either a meticulous fraudster whose operational security was so absolute that it left no trace anywhere in 31 months of activity, and who somehow maintained control of offshore assets while under federal supervision. Or he is a man whose professional identity was harvested by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, used to build a $62 million financial operation while he sat in his glass-walled office managing other people's retirement accounts, and is now standing trial for crimes committed by a ghost sophisticated enough to move money across 4 continents without leaving a name. Or something in between those two possibilities. Something the evidence points toward without ever quite reaching. The trial will produce a verdict. Verdicts are not the same as answers, and the question that will remain after whatever the jury decides is the one that investigators themselves have not been able to close. $62 million moved. Someone moved it. Someone built the structure it moved through. Someone accessed those offshore accounts after the indictment. Someone sent that due diligence inquiry, or Mercer fabricated the story of having received it. One of those things is true. And here's what makes this case genuinely different from the ones that have clean endings. There is documented evidence from 3 independent forensic disciplines that points in incompatible directions. That doesn't happen by accident. When evidence contradicts itself this precisely, it means something. Either the crime was designed to produce this confusion, which requires a level of planning that raises its own disturbing questions about who is capable of it. Or the investigation is missing a piece that, if found, would make everything else align. That piece has not been found. And until it is, the case of Daniel Mercer sits in a category that investigators rarely like to admit exists. Fully documented, extensively analyzed, and logically incomplete. The evidence is all there. It just doesn't close. And that, more than anything else in this file, is what keeps the people who know it best from sleeping easily at night.